In this episode, we will look at the advance on Kyiv from the eastern border of Russia. I'll be specifically looking at it from an operational level only, as the tactical level review of satellite imagery will be in the next episode. Which brings us to the question of what happened in the Kyiv battle on the other side of the Dnieper River. In a common theme with this series so far, it comes down to logistics. Specifically, it's important to look at highways and trains. As an opening point, for most of the battle on this side of the Dnieper River, I don't have Google Earth satellite images, and I don't have any media or reporting source that I trust in terms of where the Russian forces actually went and which areas they took. In terms of conforming with the satellite image information that I do have, surprisingly, the best map is actually the one that's found on Wikipedia, which I've displayed here. Now, we've discussed in great detail the advance south through the Chernobyl exclusion zone that wound up being stopped around Antonov Airport and Myla. Now we'll be looking at these two advances in the north towards Chernihiv, this advance on Konotop, and the advance towards Sumy. The key to this region is controlling the limited canalizing terrain as well as the junction towns where the highway system and the railway system meet. As a result of Soviet planning and construction, these are surprisingly rare. There's very limited highways, they don't connect very well with each other, and the railway system rarely runs parallel with the highway system. Therefore, in order to advance on Kyiv, the Russians would need to seize Chernihiv, Konotop, and Sumy, then Nizhyn and Romny, and finally, in order to conduct high-intensity fight in the city of itself, Pryluki and Pyryatyn. The road network on the eastern side of the Dnieper River is a lot better than it is through the Chernobyl exclusion zone, with there even being a few roads that Western Europeans would call a highway. In this image, the major highways are in orange, with minor highways in white. Although it's viable to advance for a mechanized army through this region, the road network is still very sparse. For comparison, here's the major highway network in Western Europe and North America. Looking at canalizing terrain, there's some fairly good wooded areas taking up approximately the first 30 kilometers of the border with Russia and Belarus. This would have functioned as a good defensive belt if the Ukrainians had mobilized quickly enough to take up positions within this canalizing terrain. After this wooded area near the border, the terrain opens up considerably into the stereotypical open steppe of this area of Ukraine. There is some canalizing terrain for the city of Chernihiv. Romny is also canalizing terrain, due to the layout of woods and rivers being parallel to the Russian advance. For similar reasons, there's canalizing terrain more in depth on the road between Chernihiv and Kyiv and just forward of Pryluki. However, the options for defense in this area are very limited, with open terrain that's excellent for tanks, and most of the rivers running parallel to the Russian advance rather than perpendicular. In terms of the big picture, at the end of the first day, the Russians had managed to reach the outskirts of Chernihiv and seize Konotop. They had also bypassed Sumy after an unsuccessful attempt to seize the city. This means that with the exception of Sumy, the Russians had managed to seize the canalizing terrain on the border prior to the Ukrainians organizing any kind of effective defense. However, this is when the Russian advance bogged down due to logistical issues. Sumy continued to hold out and apparently was not seized by the Russian forces at any time. There was a slow advance out of Konotop, but the main battle occurred over the next 10 days around the outskirts of Chernihiv. This is often called the Siege of Chernihiv, although the Russians never completely surrounded the city. By the 10th day of the invasion, it became obvious to the Russians that they weren't going to be able to seize Chernihiv. Therefore, of the first 3 junction cities that the Russians would rely very heavily on for logistics, they'd only been able to seize one, Konotop. Around D+14, a large Russian armored column made a narrow front push down the highway system out of Konotop towards Kyiv. However, they didn't have the strength to seize the key junction city of Nizhyn, and therefore the advance was fairly easily stopped outside of Kyiv at Kalyanivka. Therefore, apart from one narrow front push down the highway from Konotop, by the 10th day of the invasion, the Russian advance had bogged down due to their only seizing one of the 3 first key rail and road juncture cities. With Chernihiv and Sumy still in Ukrainian hands, the lack of good defensive terrain was irrelevant. The Russians didn't have the logistical ability to support an advance that would seize the next set of towns, that is, Romny and Nizhyn. They also weren't willing or weren't able to support a street-by-street battle to seize Chernihiv and Sumy. Even if the Russians had committed to a street-by-street battle in these two junction cities, they likely would have destroyed all of the infrastructure they needed to support an advance on Kyiv after a multi-week battle. And the reason for this largely comes down to the different way that the Russian army conducts logistics. For the Russian army, each combined arms army, which is roughly the equivalent of a corps within the NATO system, is supported by something called an MTO brigade. This is a transportation unit consisting of a little over 400 trucks and railway troops, and they tend to deliver supplies directly from the railhead, that is where supplies are offloaded from a railway terminal, via truck to the brigades. With the number of trucks that they hold, they have the capacity to allow the main body of the Russian troops to operate up to about 150 kilometers from the railhead. This is considerably less capacity than a Western army. To begin with, Western armies don't tend to have railway troops. Civilian transportation firms move supplies by sea lift, rail, or airlift up to the edge of the potential combat zone. Once you're within range of the enemy's deep battle assets, such as fighter bombers and MLRS launchers, supplies are transported by truck in military vehicles. Because the Russians use railway troops that are part of the military, they're able to bring supplies via rail much closer to the front line. To give a sense of how different this is, a Western army wouldn't consider it an enormous challenge to operate, say, 400 to 600 kilometers from the railhead to the main body of their frontline troops. This is accomplished through having easily 2 to 3 times as many trucks per combat unit as in the Russian army. And to give an idea of where this fits within historical context, at 150 kilometers between the railhead and the main body of frontline troops, the current Russian army is only slightly ahead of the logistical system in World War I, where there was an average distance of 125 kilometers between the railhead and the front line. For the advance on Kyiv, on the eastern side of the Dnieper River, there would have been 2 MTO brigades, one supporting the push on Chernihiv and another one supporting both the Konotop and Sumy advances. Now, railheads can't just go anywhere along a railway area. You need to have somewhere where you can unload multiple trains, turn them around, and then send them back into your own rear. That area needs to be outside of the range of enemy artillery. You then need to have a road network that you control that's also relatively outside the range of enemy artillery to go from the railhead to the frontline units. Once you apply this to a railway and highway map of this area of Ukraine, the details of the Russian advance in terms of when they surged forward and where they halted almost perfectly matches up with the 150-kilometer support range of the MTO brigades. For the advance on Chernihiv, assuming the railhead was located just over the border at the closest significant railway junction, the support range of the MTO brigades ends on the western side of the city. This is exactly where there was a pause of about 1 week in the encirclement of Chernihiv, as the Russians would have had to relocate their railhead. However, because Chernihiv was still in the possession of the Ukrainians, and that the unit there had artillery, they only would have been able to move it just inside the border here. The supply route would have had to skirt very wide around Chernihiv to avoid having those convoys attacked by artillery. As a result, the support range from the MTO brigades only extends to here, which is almost exactly where the Russian encirclement of Chernihiv stalled. For the eastward advance, the MTO brigade sustainment range runs out just short of the city of Konotop. However, the Russians appear to have seized that. Now, assuming they were able to move the railhead to Konotop, their sustainment range then reached out to the outskirts of Priluki, but not far enough to actually seize the town, which is precisely what happened. Now, there is a suitable railhead site halfway between Konotop and Nizhyn. Assuming that this was used as a railhead by the Russians, that would have moved the edge of sustainment range from the MTO brigades to approximately here on the outskirts of Kyiv, which is precisely where the advance bogged down yet again. Now, it's quite important to remember that in estimating the range of the MTO brigades, it's not a question of straight distance. It's a question of distance traveled over roads. And therefore, controlling highways that go in straight lines is much more important than rural backroads. To give you an idea just how much of an impact this has, let's assume that the Russians had managed to seize Chernihiv on the first day, and they'd established a railhead inside of Chernihiv. If this were the case, then the MTO sustainment range would have reached into the middle of downtown Kyiv. But in the end, the Russians only managed to seize Konotop, and this meant the maximum that they could achieve was encircling Sumy, nearly encircling Chernihiv, and a narrow front sort of poke at the outer perimeter of the Kyiv defenses. You may remember 2 episodes ago, I showed you this map with red circles indicating where the media reported significant fighting on the western side of Kyiv. Well, here's that same image, but with red circles showing where there were media reports of significant fighting on the eastern side of the Dnieper River. Beyond the obvious point that there are less reported battle locations, it's obvious that the Russians weren't able to penetrate past the green belt on the outskirts of the city. For these 2 battle locations that were closest to the city of Kyiv, we know that these were both ambushes where the Russians quickly withdrew, because both of them were caught on video by drones and were some of the most popular shared media about the conflict in the opening weeks. Therefore, combat on the eastern side of Kyiv was significantly less intense than combat on the western side of Kyiv, which does make sense given the transportation infrastructure analysis that I've run through. Specifically, while there is more infrastructure on the eastern side of the Dnieper River, the Russians would have need to have seized a number of key rail and road junction towns in order to use that infrastructure, which simply wasn't possible, given the size of forces they deployed. So let's summarize what I believe I've shown about the operational level for the Kyiv battle, before I get into some speculation about what the Russian objectives might have been had everything gone according to their plan.
What did we learn, Palmer?
I don't know, sir.
Oh, but
I'm going to make 2 operational level points. The first operational level point is that the Russian failure wasn't as a result of trucks, but as a result of trains. They went into the conflict knowing that they had a system that required a railhead to be within 150 kilometers. In the first couple of weeks of the war, social media was full of stories and videos about ambushes of truck convoys and shortages of trucks. This is likely for a couple of reasons. For one, observers would have been comparing it to what they knew, which is the level of truck support that exists in NATO armies. The Russian system isn't ineffective, it just operates a different way that requires seizing railheads, which is totally fine, provided you actually seize the railheads. Another reason that the losses of trucks were probably overstated was because there were a number of convoys that attempted to go through Sumy right after the first wave of fighting vehicles blitzed through the town without opposition. And it was these convoys that were attacked by the National Guard troops, and that's where most of the videos come from. However, in this article by Military Review out of the Army University Press, it was estimated that the Russians lost 2 MTO transport battalions worth of trucks as of August 2020. This analysis is really only looking at the first phase of the invasion that ended in April of 2020. They also used Oryx as a source, which is generally known as being quite Ukraine-friendly, and therefore you should typically take the numbers they ascribe as the upper realistic amounts. Even given that, 2 battalions of MTO transport trucks only accounts for about 20% of the MTO transport trucks allocated to the invasion of Ukraine. Losing 20% of your transport trucks over a 6-month campaign in near-peer warfare is actually quite normal. So while Western media has gone on and on and on about the Russian issue logistically to do with trucks, the truck-based part of their logistics system appears to have actually functioned quite well. What failed was the railway system. In order to have avoided that, the Russians either needed to build a very different type of military, one that likely they would have quite difficulty sustaining as an economy, or they needed to work out a system whereby they more effectively seized railway junction towns in the first week of the conflict. The second operational point is that although the Russians are unable to seize Chernihiv, the siege of Chernihiv did give them a lot of flexibility on other fronts. This is because at the outbreak of the war, Ukraine only had 2 regular force armored brigades. One of them was garrisoned in Chernihiv and held the city during the encirclement. With one of them largely encircled in an urban area, which is just about the least efficient use of a tank brigade, the Ukrainians were deprived of approximately half of their key counterattack force for the first month of the war. This isn't seizing Kyiv, but it does make your job a lot easier in the center and south of the country. But based on the information that I trust, what is it that I can tell you about Russia's likely intentions for the Kyiv battle had things all gone according to plan? At the end of the last episode, I outlined 5 possible intentions the Russians may have had for the axis of advance out of the Chernobyl exclusion zone towards Kyiv. I concluded that it could not have been a coup de guerre or an attempt to seize the capital along that axis of advance had there been any serious resistance. However, I left open the possibility that the Russian force on the eastern side of the Dnieper River was meant to seize Kyiv even in the face of significant resistance. So let's assume that the Russians had managed to seize all the junction towns. There hadn't been significant resistance in places like Sumy or Chernihiv, and as a result, virtually all of the Russian forces on the eastern side of the Dnieper River had arrived at the outskirts of Kyiv. According to documents the Ukrainians claim to have captured from the Russians, eastern Kyiv would have been assaulted by 3 combined arms armies, roughly the equivalent of a corps in the NATO system. The 41st in the north, 2nd Guards in the center, and 1st Guards in the south. With the way the battle played out, 41st Combined Arms Army became bogged down in fighting around Chernihiv, but elements of 2nd Guards and 1st Guards appear to have reached the outskirts of Kyiv. But for this, of course, we're assuming that didn't happen. What I've done here is taken every district or suburb within the eastern bank of Kyiv, and then calculated the minimum viable number of brigades it would take in order to seize that district or suburb against organized but not particularly determined opposition. And to give a bit of perspective, this area here that's indicated as a minimum 3-brigade district is about the same size as Bakhmut. I then did calculations based on an appendix to a book by Sasho Todorov, where he did a rough estimate of the number of battalions allocated to each combined arms army and the objectives of that combined arms army. And from that it appears that the equivalent of 8 brigades, one of which is reinforced, was destined for the eastern side of Kyiv, if we use the high estimate within that resource. Now, the number of actual brigade or divisional headquarters involved would have been much higher than this, because the Russians tend to deploy understrength units and brigades of 1 or 2 battalions instead of the typical 3. I'll also say that this high number is definitely too much, as in this calculation there's about 165,000 soldiers overall involved in just the frontline infantry and armored units for the invasion, when I've never seen an estimate over 190,000 in terms of the number of Russian soldiers deployed overall for the initial invasion. I don't think this is because Sasho has done something wrong, but because he's counting the number of battalions, which we're fairly certain were not at full strength, but something closer to 70 to 80% strength at the beginning of the invasion, whereas my analysis is converting units to 100% strength, because if you have 2 half-strength battalions or 1 full-strength battalion, the effect on the enemy is the same. From that same resource, I calculated the low number for what was headed towards eastern Kyiv was 6 brigades, with 1 of them being reinforced. However, this is just what was contained within 41st Combined Arms Army, 2nd Guards, and the elements of 1st Guards that were headed towards the eastern side of Kyiv. In order to determine what could have been used in the assault on the eastern side of Kyiv, you need to start taking away units that were involved in other completely essential tasks. For instance, there needs to have been a reserve. I've set aside 1 brigade as the absolute bare minimum, although 2 brigades for a reserve would be what doctrinally is called for as the minimum. There also needs to be a brigade allocated to flank guard. And because of the number of junction towns, with still at least some resistance expected, that they had to seize on the way for their approximately 300-kilometer journey to eastern Kyiv, at a bare minimum they would need 2 brigades for rear area security. This means after deducting these essential tasks, on the high end, the assault force on eastern Kyiv would have been 4 brigades, 1 of which is reinforced, and on the low end, 2 brigades, 1 of which is reinforced. Now, because that isn't enough brigades to assault across the entire area of operations in eastern Kyiv simultaneously, you would also need to allocate units to be a blocking or front guard force against the suburbs or districts that are not being assaulted. And doing rough math, this works out to about 4 battalion tactical groups, or the single reinforced brigade. This means the assault force for eastern Kyiv would have been, under the best of all possible scenarios, 3 brigades, and under the low estimate, a single brigade. Using the high estimate as an example, they could have 3 brigades assault this first suburb called Brovary, and they would have the number of forces in order to fight their way through. Though it being urban combat, we would expect very high casualties and significant delays. After a pause for reconstitution and replacement of casualties, they'd then be able to take these other 2 smaller suburbs just to the south. But at that point, they'd be unable to advance without clearing the other suburbs to the north and south in the 41st and 1st Guards area of operations, and several weeks would have passed by. In brief, as a best-case scenario, they'd be able to clear this first set of suburbs outside the Greenbelt, and then they'd run out of steam. Using the single brigade low estimate, it's even simpler. On encountering some resistance in the suburb of Brovary, they would be unable to advance and have to withdraw, which is, of course, is exactly what happened, as the 2 battalion tactical groups that were filmed being ambushed near this area equate to slightly less than 1 brigade. So going back to our list of possible Russian intents for the Battle of Kyiv, I think we can strike off seizing the capital against organized resistance. As the last episode showed, the infrastructure through the Pripyat marshes was never sufficient to support a seizure of the capital along that axis of advance. While there is the proper infrastructure on the eastern side of the Dnieper River, the scale of forces committed by the Russians was well below what would have been needed to have seized the capital, even if everything had gone entirely according to plan. You simply can't fight your way through a major city with a strike force of only 3 brigades. However, this isn't exactly unexpected, as it's part of Russian doctrine to avoid fighting in urban areas. This is from a U.S. military manual on current Russian doctrine from February of 2024, where it states that when conducting offensive actions in an area of operation that contains dense urban terrain, the SV, that's the Russian army, bypasses it if possible. Instead, they use surprise and maneuver in order to ensure that the target area is encircled to prevent resupply or reinforcement of the aggressor garrison. And as a bonus point, it then states that Russian doctrinal frontage for a company in an urban area is 2 to 3 blocks, which works out to between 700 meters and a kilometer per battalion, showing that if anything, I'd underestimated the amount of forces Russia needed to have committed had they planned an urban battle around Kyiv. But this leads into the next question about the Battle of Kyiv, namely, did the Russians intend to encircle the city? Russia's not unique in having a doctrinal preference to encircle urban areas rather than fight their way through them. Fighting in urban areas is something of a nightmare, and in particular, it removes a lot of the advantages from militaries that have superior training, heavy firepower, and technology. It's not a coincidence that the list of large battles in major urban centers in near-peer warfare is surprisingly short. It's much better to encircle a city, and then hopefully the garrison will surrender without having to fight your way from block to block. In the worst-case scenario, you'll be fighting an enemy that has limited supplies of food and ammunition and an inability to resupply. Now, because Kyiv is built along the Dnieper River, in order to encircle Kyiv, the Russians would need to seize crossings of the Dnieper River to the south of the city. This is a lot harder than you'd expect, as the Dnieper River is a lot closer to a long, narrow lake than your conception of a river. For this map, I put a blue circle for every single location where there's a bridge along the Dnieper River, with the size of the circle indicating the number of bridges. That's 7 crossing locations for a 900-kilometer stretch of river. The 2 closest bridge locations are at Kyiv and Cherkasy, about 100 and 150 kilometers southeast of Kyiv. However, the Russian plan apparently only had 3 brigades advancing from Sumy to seize these 2 cities. In order to even reach Kyiv and Cherkasy, they would have to advance across 400 kilometers while seizing about 7 key junction towns or cities. Against organized resistance, Kyiv would probably require a minimum of 3 brigades to seize, and Cherkasy would probably require about 5. So if the Ukrainian army stood their ground and fought, any Russian plan to encircle the city would have involved military engineers constructing a pontoon bridge somewhere between Kyiv and Kyiv. However, to construct a pontoon bridge in a combat zone requires a number of very specific criteria. Although it's theoretically possible to make a pontoon bridge as long as necessary, in practical terms, it needs to be under a kilometer. This rules out 3/4 of the area between Kyiv and Kyiv, as in this red shade area, the Dnieper River is never narrower than 6 kilometers wide. And as you can see from this photo of this part of the Dnieper River, it's better to think of it as a sort of inland waterway, or even an inland ocean, than to think of it as a river. Therefore, any viable crossing sites would need to be in this black box here, closer to the southern outskirts of Kyiv. A pontoon bridge location also needs to have a fairly good road that goes down to the edge of the river on both ends of where the pontoon bridge is going to be emplaced. And by this criteria, I was only able to find about 3 viable sites, which were 1.8, 1.5, and 0.6 kilometers wide. Therefore, we'll look in more detail at the green triangle crossing site as the most viable option. The most direct route through the least urban terrain to the green triangle crossing site isn't possible, as there isn't actually any through road through these 2 suburb locations. Flanking round to the north isn't possible, as at that point you're really just fighting your way through Kyiv, so seizing the crossing site is going to involve flanking through the south. The crossing site itself is an unnamed suburb made up of marinas, luxury resorts, and oligarchs' dachas, and as an objective would probably require 2 brigades to seize. In order to access this crossing site, you'd first have to fight your way through the suburb of Vyshensky, which is another 3-brigade objective. You would also need to clear the Ukrainians out of these 2 neighboring suburbs, which are each 2-brigade objectives, in order to limit the amount of direct and indirect fire being called down on the engineers as they build the pontoon bridge. There is a light forested area with minimal built-up or urban terrain for accessing Vyshensky. However, there's no through roads through this area either. Therefore, the Russians would need to secure this route that skirts along the side of the Boryspil airport, which is Kyiv's main international airport. Clearing the route itself adds another 3-brigade objective and a 1-brigade objective. The airport needs to be cleared, which is a 2-brigade objective. And then these 2 small towns that have line of sight to the route, which adds 2 more 1-brigade objectives. According to the high estimate of Russian units involved, the 2nd Guards Tank Army in this region south of Kyiv had just 2 brigades, when at an absolute minimum, fighting your way through to the Green Triangle crossing site would have required 6 brigades. Again, this is 6 brigades at the objective site, not counting the need for reserve, flank guard, and rear area security. However, encircling Kyiv would have required the forces coming out of the Chernobyl exclusion zone to link up on the other side. And here, if anything, the situation is even worse. On this map, we can see the 2 blue symbols for where the Russian advance was stopped. Any encirclement would have involved the forces along the Chernobyl axis of advance to have done this wide swing around the south of Kyiv, fighting their way through numerous large towns and more distant suburbs, many of which were larger than places like Hostomel and Irpin. Conservatively, this swing around the south of Kyiv would have required at least an additional 6 brigades, when, as we've discussed, against organized resistance from the Ukrainian army, the Russians would have struggled to have adequately supplied 3 brigades in the vicinity of Kyiv out of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Therefore, I'm discounting Kyiv being encircled in the face of determined Ukrainian resistance, or even organized Ukrainian resistance, as a Russian goal of the invasion. Had this been their goal, they would have required at least tripling the size of the force they were capable of logistically supporting through the Chernobyl exclusion zone. It also would have required, at the very least, tripling the size of the force on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River that was advancing to the south of Kyiv. This leaves 2 viable possible goals on the part of the Russians for the Battle of Kyiv. Either they assumed little resistance, or this was intended as a feint. To examine this question, we need to look at what is meant by an assumption within military staff planning, and what exactly is a feint. We also need to look at the dynamics between generals, military planners, and the national leadership to understand why it's actually quite difficult to determine whether or not the advance on Kyiv was meant as a feint or done under an assumption of minimal resistance. However, we're approaching 30 minutes, and so we'll have to leave that for another day.